Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. I recently had the pleasure of speaking with longtime listener Dr. Katie Singer to discuss her book, Alien Soil. The book focuses on first-hand accounts from African American Newark residents who lived in the area during the Great Migration. She expertly distilled over 100 oral histories in building her book, crafting a thoughtful examination of the Black urban experience. Dr. Singer has a PhD in American Studies from Rutgers University, Newark, and an MFA in creative writing. She has taught writing, literature, and African American studies for 10 years and was an absolute joy to chat with. We recorded our interview over Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Welcome back, everyone. Joining me today is Dr. Katie Singer. She is an educator, writer, and oral historian whose latest book, Alien Soil, will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Singer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming on. So I want to go ahead and dive right into your amazing book. So you outline how this collection of oral histories was the result of a project that never got off the ground. So can you provide a bit of a backstory to that?
Sure. It's basically chapter one of the book, but a Black cultural center was supposed to be built in Newark in New Jersey, inside the Kruger Scott Mansion, which was last owned by beauty entrepreneur Louise Scott. And so the idea was to create in there a sort of archive museum, in Newark. There were other sorts of things. Anyway, timing, politics, money, all got in the way. And if you read chapter one, I do is sort of the soap opera version of the Black Culture Center that never was.
Yeah. It was a fascinating story, and I really appreciated having the context because I knew as soon as I was diving into this, I wanted to know kind of how come we hadn't heard about these stories before. And I think you really help lay a good groundwork for why these stories remain kind of undertold.
Good. I'm so glad that was useful.
And so diving into these stories, you discuss the role of churches in the Black Newark community and how nuanced it was. So how do these stories counter some common perceptions of Black Americans?
Well, I think, there are some folks who still think that, when we say the Black community, as if everybody, as if it was a monolith. And I think that gets applied to the Black church as well, the Black church. So all Black churches are not the same, and all Black churchgoers aren't either. And not all African Americans even go to church, for many reasons. And I think the narratives show us all the ways that they were having relationships with the church and their feelings and their activities, and how it translated from what they were doing in the South to what they were doing in the North. What a great thing it was for some people, and a hindrance to others. The Black church, of course, is so relevant as a foundation of African American culture and history. And in that way, it can be considered singular, but today, especially, just like then, really, there is just no one Black church. And so I think these interviewees really make that clear and remind us that it's not just the churches we see in the documentaries about the civil rights movement or something.
Yeah. And you also highlighted how Sundays weren't only for church. And so what were some of the other activities Newark residents engaged in, and what do their memories of this tell us about this time period?
some people had to work on Sunday, even if they wanted to go to church, right? And there were also a lot of other activities, again, challenging that idea that all African Americans always go to church on Sunday. So there were the Newark Eagles, which was the famous black baseball team that actually won one of the World Series in the Negro Leagues. A lot of them, food was a big discussion for some people and not all. That was the only day they really had time to stay home and cook. So they would cook and eat. They went to parks, which Newark has had even more. They went to clubs to hear music. Now, there's definitely a sort of divide about some people being more comfortable talking about going to clubs, or they would go during the day to hear gospel, and others went at night for the more drinks and jazz and blues kind of vibe. They went downtown. Newark, like so many cities, had a thriving downtown that looks really different than the downtown of today. So just walking downtown, the stories that they tell about the window shopping. Now, of course, as an aside, some of them were window shopping because that was the only thing they were allowed to do, being African Americans in a segregated city. But just walking around and it was a segregated life in some spaces, but it was one that many of the narrators in their telling of the interviews, and remember, they are talking to peers, so it's not like the WPA narratives, not to discount those, but they were not always speaking to their peers, talking about their enslavement experience. Telling their peers and exchanging stories about what they did on Sunday that was clearly a segregated experience. And there was a lot of access there compared to, for many of them, what they were experiencing in the South.
Yeah. And as somebody who studies labor pretty extensively and the very different nuances of the meaning of work, I was particularly fascinated and zoned in on your chapter talking about work for the Black community in Newark. And so that chapter really highlights that many different meanings of work kind of applied for the people of Newark. So can you share a little bit about how work was flexible for this community?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you enjoyed that chapter. The point I really wanted to make was that in this African American community, again, like so many mid 20th century and also today, there's a lot of work that doesn't get paid, and that's for a lot of reasons. African Americans are quite often forced into work simply in order to bridge like yawning gaps in services and et cetera, things that should be provided by municipal, state, and federal governments. So there's that. So I don't know that I was saying work was as flexible as much as it was kind of amorphous, because it was constant and spread across so many spheres of life, from job to family to politics. And even within their paying jobs, often came so much extra labor just in order to, keep their jobs, advocate for themselves, contend with racism and sexism. And then, yeah, there's a lot of community mindedness in many of these interviews. And let me make it clear that in no way did all these 100 plus people all have the same experience, but there was a lot of community focus and consciousness. And so that led to work, both paid and otherwise.
Yeah, I think what stood out for me, and perhaps it's because I'm such a fan of Alice Kessler Harris as well, is that it was reminding me of her work on studying about women, and women have always worked, whether it's considered a paid labor source or not. And I think that's what I really took away from your chapter about work, is that their work wasn't your normal stereotypical 9-to-5 job. It could look like many different pieces, but it was all labor and it all mattered.
Exactly.
And so you also talk about how activism had this nuanced interpretation among those interviewed. So can you talk a little bit about this and how the interviewers got around this apprehension for some to talk about their activism?
So for me, activism is a really important part of this book. It highlights the work of so many ordinary people, quote unquote, and especially the women. And it's something when you read the books on Newark history, I'm afraid that these women's stories often are left to the side. Um, Newark is a very political, activist city. It has been for a long time. So that was really important for me. And what I learned in listening to these interviews is that, especially the women, but not just the women, often shied away from being called activists or political, which was the term back then and the term used on the questionnaire. And so there was a specific question asked about community work, and then a different one asked about political work. And what I point out in the book is that the women tended to call all of their work community, though it often seemed quite political, it in the sense that they were, affecting changes in policy. So they might say in response to the question, tell me about your political work, they'd say, oh, I'm not political. And then the next question will be, are you involved in any community activities? And then they're like doing 1,000 things. Yeah, the men did tend more often to acknowledge their work more readily. And what was interesting, and this project is unique in that there are peer interviewers, and the peers didn't really seem to see the issue between political and community as so stark as I did listening to it from afar. And I do a number of presentations at conferences and have written about listening to oral histories. Sometimes we get really involved in the generating of these collections, which obviously is so important. But we kind of forget about sometimes thinking about what do we do with all these established collections now that they're here. So for me, the community work versus political work sort of blurred the lines and was one big umbrella of, again, like you said, just constant labor.
Yeah. And I'm curious because you mentioned, it was largely predominantly women who kind of shied away from taking that activism mantle. Any thoughts or theories as to perhaps why women specifically were so hesitant to kind of claim that label of activist for themselves?
Well, I mean, I have theories. I mean, I have gender theories based on, these interviews are done in the 1990s, and I don't think we're quite done yet with women getting the message that we're supposed to hide our light a little bit more and not be boastful and all those sorts of things. And these women are aware that this is being recorded and supposedly going to be put into a public place. And then there's a whole theorizing around Black respectability. Some people have issue with using that kind of framework, but the idea being that African Americans and especially the women are sort of expected to carry this kind of respectability around and show and emulate this kind of sophisticated, I'm trying to think of synonyms, but basically to really sound all the time as if they're a bit humble. And so that framework might also be applied to that.
Yeah. No, I think you're hitting on something in kind of that analysis. And you talk about listening to oral histories. And so you built this collection, like you said, based on interviews already collected by people interviewing their peers. And so how did you kind of decide to piece your narrative together using these oral histories?
Well, I mean, how long do you want me to? So the framework of the book just came from listening to these interviews so many times. So the literally shoebox of cassette tapes were uncovered. We don't say discovered because somebody already found them, but they were uncovered by a fellow graduate student at the time at Rutgers, Dr. Sam Boardman, who's just one of the most generous scholars and people you could ever meet. And if she's listening, where are you? I need to find you. But we then went to digitizing them just to save them because they were on cassette tapes. And so we cut and paste small stories, splitting. And so I listened to these things so many times that themes just arrived in my brain. And during this time, I was going to write about something totally different for my dissertation, but there was no way. These people's voices were so important. So I boiled it down to chapters including Sundays, work days, and hot days, which is fires, urban fires, and rebellion. And I'm not a very academic writer. I have an MFA in creative writing after all. So it was really important for me for the book to be accessible and interesting to everybody. So part of that thinking of putting the book together was, would somebody want to read it at a book club or interview somebody on a podcast? I don't know. So yeah, and I definitely was thinking of the book. How can I just be totally blanking on The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson? This is one of those, if you are interested in that book, you'd be interested in my book kind of thing. I do it differently, a lot more interviews and with a more historical framework, just because I'm a historian, she's a journalist, but that same kind of storytelling vibe, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I thought it was effectively put together. I appreciated the Sundays, the work days, and the hot days. I thought that was a creative way of piecing it together and kind of embedding us in this community and giving the reader a snapshot of what it was like for the average Newark resident, right? This wasn't, there were, some political interviews, but, they weren't all politicians and they weren't all big government leaders, right? They were your everyday citizens. And I thought it was a pretty effective way of kind of gleaning the nuance and the themes so that we could really understand what their experiences were, what their memories of their experiences were. So it was well done for what it's worth, in my opinion.
It's worth a lot. Thank you.
And so this book is filled with characters who tell such rich stories. Was there one individual whose story kind of stood out to you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm a super fangirl of Louise Epperson, and she's very well known in Newark, but not outside. And yet this is a woman who was an everyday person, right? Who's and by the way, that's who made this country through the Great Migration, are everyday people, as an aside, right? So Louise Epperson is dynamic. She's brave. She's the everyday person who changed history. But outside of Newark, and maybe inside too, not that many people know her name. When she ignited a grassroots battle against an eminent domain takeover by a state dental school. And so you read about that actually in the rebellion chapter, because it's what many consider one of the legs on the stool of creating that uprising in 1967. She started meeting with people at her kitchen table, literally, after she learned that her home and her neighborhood were going to be demolished in the newspaper. So she reached out to politicians, big shots. She went to bars and got on tables to warn her people. And, she just thought she was going to retire as an occupational therapist, and she thought she'd really done well for herself, which she had. And suddenly she was just launched into, hyper activism. Yeah. And she changed the city's history.
I think she was kind of a stunning example of how the politics is personal, right? Yeah. And that's, somebody who was wanting to be a, quote unquote, normal person in kind of being forced into a situation that required her to be an activist and to really demand some change in her community.
Yeah, totally.
And this book demonstrates in many, many ways how important oral histories are. I know we've kind of chatted offline about the importance of securing oral history and kind of sharing that with the masses. But can you share a bit about your thoughts on how and why it is important to collect the stories of the quote unquote normal people?
Right. I mean, this is where you start a oral historian talking. We're never going to shut up because it feels like still, and maybe more, this kind of resistance to the history that permeates our school system. So history is actually lived by the everyday person. And our country has had this habit since the beginning of having history told by the few, and about the few, those with stature. And specifically in our history, that's white males. And so kind of like a game of telephone, while our thinking has progressed and we sort of intellectually know that can't quite be the case, so many stories have been distilled into all sorts of books and other sources. And especially I think about the classroom because I'm a teacher. And a whole bunch of stories have remained at the wayside. And so students today are still often taken aback by what regular people have to say about the history that they think they already know. I have so many students who say, "Oh no, I already studied Civil War. Oh no, I studied," as if that there was some finite amount of information. I mean, because I use oral histories in the classroom so much, I've had student evaluations that literally admonish me for using that, for not talking enough about certain texts that they clearly already know, and that's why they're naming them. For teaching too much Black history in a U.S. history course, spending too much time on Indigenous narratives. So we have a long way to go to where it's normalized to have some kind of reasonable cross section of voices in the history lessons of today. And I mean, all we have to do is look at what's going on politically right now to know that none of these folks ever listened to the story of a regular person living history, because if they did, they wouldn't have these completely confused, outrageous ideas of what has happened in our country and why our country looks like it does now.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, as somebody who has become an oral historian in some aspects, I think many people forget that the historical way of telling stories, of capturing our past, was through an oral tradition. So really capturing oral histories is just about doing what people have always done for millennia. And so I think the oral history tradition hopefully will gain more steam as we move ahead, and we can get a more nuanced and a more complete sense as kind of as you were hinting to like what our past was and what it meant for the everyday person who was experiencing the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson or the Jim Crow South or California politics during Reagan's time as governor, right? These are all nuanced, and you can't get perspectives by only looking at the quote unquote great people of history, right? You need the otherwise unknown individuals.
Correct.
Yeah. And so what is something you want readers to take away from this book?
Yeah, that's like such a hard question in a way, because I want people to take away whatever they want. I hope they'll have questions, just question things, and to accept, if they don't already, that all people's stories are important for some reason or another, like literally every human's. And we just keep leaving out certain groups of human stories, and that has got to change. I hope that folks will know that people who have something to say can change our perspective, the countries, the worlds. Also, I think it's really important that as a white historian whose work is in African American history and culture, I hope that this book shows me foregrounding the voices of those with the lived experience, and then adding contextualization based on my historical knowledge and writing skills. So I guess I want to say, like, I hope I'm letting these folks tell their own damn stories for a change. And I hope to be doing that in the future with my other books and projects. It's kind of what think I'm here for.
Yeah. And you talked about how these oral histories they originated on cassette tapes, and that there was some work to digitize them. And so where should people go when they finish the book and they want to learn more about these people and the oral history project?
Well, I sure hope that's what people want to do. So I really thank you for asking that. There have been a few really cool public history projects that have been generated in Newark based on these narratives, including a fabulous glass books student project out of Rutgers. And people could just Google Glass Books Rutgers. The website with all the interviews on it is live and accessible through Rutgers, but it's undersourced. So we have interviews, a few photos, but not a fabulous finding aid. So there's been some energy behind that off and on these past years. And I'm kind of hoping that maybe my book helps renew the interest in updating that website so that anybody I'm basically the finding aid right now. So that should be easy for everyone to look up anything. So, yeah.
And where should people go to learn more about you and your scholarship?
Well, I have a website. It's katie-singer.com. It's a WordPress website. And on there's information on how to order the book if they're so interested, and all the contact, my email, and I'm on all the socials, as you say. I do wear a few hats. So if you look me up, I'm the Katie Singer that's a writer, historian, activist, and boxing instructor. So there's a couple Katie Singers floating around the internet, but not all of them are me.
And I know that you just wrapped this up. This book literally just hit the shelves as we're kind of having this conversation today. But do you have another project in the pipeline that you can share a bit about?
Well, so I have another book coming out that I co-authored, and I'm really excited about. My friend Maurice Tyree, he spent 20 years in prison, and while in prison wrote all these letters. We've turned it into a memoir with historical context, and I'll have all the information on my website there, but it's coming out probably the end of this month or next month. And it's called The Darkest Parts of My Blackness. Mm-hmm. And it's really a call to action as much as anything to reform this prison system that we are so clearly committed to. Mm-hmm. So I'm just really excited about him getting, again, his stories out and me being useful. I think that's, and now I'm working on a book that I want to sort of mirror this book, Alien Soil, and do it West Coast style. So I'm starting to do the research already because I only moved to LA 4 years ago. And so I've been cramming on West Coast history. And I have ideas for making this book, sort of the West Coast version.
Well, you'll have to come back and share about the West Coast chapter once you've got it out there in the public.
Thank you. I would love to.
And is there anything we haven't covered today that you want future readers to know?
Well, I just want to thank you so much. I really appreciate you highlighting this book. I do think it adds to the understanding that the Great Migration changed this country, that African American people are this country, and that oral histories are worth taking time to listen to. They're all over the internet and they're at your local library. And so that's what I want future readers to know, that it's about people's stories and we need to shut up and listen sometimes.
Wonderfully said. And hopefully it inspires a whole new generation of oral historians.
Amen.
All right. So for all my listeners out there, definitely pick up a copy of Alien Soil. Dr. Singer effectively demonstrates the power of oral history and weaves an incredible narrative about the Great Migration and a robust and powerful Newark community and an understudied community from our past. Thank you again, Dr. Singer.
Thank you so much.
And there you have it, my friends. My sincerest thanks again to Dr. Singer for coming on and sharing her scholarship. While I adore every single guest who comes on to the show, I will always cherish my time spent with Dr. Singer, as I rarely get to interview fans of the show who also have amazing and insightful work to share with others. If you have any interest in oral history, African American history, or are in search of a great example of beautiful writing, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Alien Soil. You won't be disappointed. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.